Blood ran from the corner of Abigail Carter's mouth as she dropped to her knees on the saloon floor, one hand pressed flat against the boards, the other clutching a leather ledger like it was the only thing keeping her alive. 50 men stood close enough to touch her. Not one moved. She lifted her face swollen and streaked red and forced the words out through broken breath. "Please, somebody help me." The saloon doors creaked. A shadow filled the frame. Every man in that room reached for his gun at once and froze. If you're watching this from your favorite chair with a cup of coffee, or you've got this playing in the background while you're cooking supper, drop a comment and tell me what city you're watching from tonight. I love knowing where this story is finding you. And if stories like this one, stories about ordinary women who refuse to stay silent, and outlaws who turn out to have more honor than the men who hunt them. If that's the kind of story that speaks to you, hit that subscribe button and stay with me, clear through to the end. You won't want to miss a single part of what happens to Abigail Carter. Nathan Kane stood in the doorway with the lantern light behind him, and for 3 full seconds, nobody in the Red Creek Saloon breathed. Then he spoke, and his voice was quiet in a way that made it worse. "Touch her again," he said, "and every lie in this town dies tonight." The enforcer standing over Abigail, a thick-necked man named Hollis Beam, who worked for Victor Langford and had never in his life been told no, let his hand drift toward his own revolver. "This ain't your business, Kane," Hollis said. "Walk on out that door and forget you saw anything." Nathan didn't stop walking. Boot heels hit the floorboards, slow, deliberate, each step its own kind of warning. "Funny thing about forgetting," Nathan said. "I got a real hard time doing it. Ask anybody in this room. Ask Victor Langford." At the name, half the saloon went stiff. Glasses stopped halfway to mouths. A card player set his hand face down on the felt without meaning to. Abigail tried to push herself up off the floor and failed, her arm shaking under her own weight. Nathan crouched beside her without taking his eyes off Hollis, and when he spoke to her, his voice changed completely soft now, careful, like a man handling something he was afraid to break. "Easy now," he said. "I got you. Don't try to stand yet." "The ledger?" Abigail whispered. "Don't let them take the ledger." "Nobody's taking anything from you." Nathan's jaw tightened. "Not tonight. Not while I'm standing here." Hollis laughed, but it didn't reach his eyes. "You're a wanted man in 3 territories, Kane. You really gonna make a stand for some woman you never met over a piece of paper?" Nathan rose slowly to his full height, and something in the way he did it made 3 men near the bar quietly step back. "She ain't just some woman," Nathan said. "And that ledger ain't just paper. It's 14 dead men's names, and every one of you standing here silent knows it." The room didn't answer. That was the worst part. Nobody argued. Nobody defended Victor Langford's honor. They just stood there staring at their boots, at their cards, at anything that wasn't Abigail Carter bleeding on the floor. 3 weeks earlier, Abigail Carter had stepped off the stage from Missouri with a single trunk, a letter folded soft from reading, and a heart full of a future she thought was waiting for her. The letter was from Samuel Brooks. Rancher, widower. A man who wrote like he meant every word, who'd told her over 8 months of correspondence that Red Creek needed a schoolteacher's steady hand, and that his ranch needed a woman who wasn't afraid of hard mornings. She'd read that letter so many times the creases had gone soft as cloth. She stepped down from the stage expecting to see him waiting. Instead, she saw a man in a fine gray coat hat, tipped just so, standing beside the station platform, with an expression arranged carefully into sympathy. "Miss Carter," the man said, "I'm afraid I bring hard news." Abigail's stomach dropped before he even finished. "Where's Samuel?" "He said he'd meet the stage himself." "Samuel Brooks passed 4 days ago," the man said. "My deepest condolences. I'm Victor Langford. I hold the note on the Brooks Ranch, and given the circumstances, I felt it only right to meet you myself and explain the situation." "The situation?" Abigail repeated. Her voice came out thinner than she wanted. "Samuel had fallen behind on considerable debts before his passing," Victor said, folding his hands in front of him like a man delivering a sermon. "Terrible business. A fall from his horse out on the North Ridge. Nobody saw it happen. By the time they found him, he let the sentence trail, shook his head with practiced sorrow. The ranch now belongs to me, Miss Carter, by the terms of the note he signed. I'm dreadfully sorry you traveled all this way for nothing. For nothing. Abigail stood on that platform with her trunk at her feet and the wind pulling at her skirt, and something in her chest that wasn't grief, yet not fully, but something colder, sharper took root instead. "May I see the note?" she asked. Victor's smile flickered just barely. "I don't see what purpose that would serve. I kept books for my late husband's dry goods store for 6 years, Mr. Langford. Figures are the one thing in this world I understand better than most men twice my age. I'd like to see the note." The silence that followed told her more than any document could have. "Of course," Victor said, finally recovering his smile. "I'll have my clerk bring it round to your lodgings. Where will you be staying?" Abigail didn't have an answer to that question. She had a ranch that no longer existed for her, a dead fiancé she'd never met in person, and $11 in her reticule. "I'll find something," she said. She found a room above the mercantile paid for with 3 days' worth of coin, and she found work faster than she found peace scrubbing floors and changing linens at the Red Creek Hotel, which she learned within her first hour of employment Victor Langford also owned. It didn't take her long to understand why a man like that would want a woman like her nearby where he could watch her, rather than a woman like her wandering loose through his town asking questions nobody wanted answered. He was wrong about that. It made her watch him closer. The note arrived 4 days later, delivered by a boy who wouldn't meet her eyes. Abigail sat by candlelight that night with the document spread across her narrow bed, and she read it the way she'd read 1,000 ledgers before, not for the story it told, but for the story it was hiding. The interest calculation was wrong. Not wrong by accident, wrong in a way that only worked if you assumed nobody would ever check the arithmetic. The witness signature at the bottom belonged to a man named Curtis Yoder. She'd seen that same signature 2 days earlier on a notice posted outside the land office witnessing an entirely different transfer of an entirely different ranch. Same hand, same ink, same date. Curtis Yoder could not have been in 2 places on the same afternoon signing 2 different documents, unless Curtis Yoder wasn't really signing anything at all. Abigail sat very still in the candlelight, the note trembling slightly in her hands, and felt the shape of something enormous begin to take form in the dark. She didn't sleep that night. She made a decision instead. She would not leave Red Creek. Not yet. Not until she understood exactly what Samuel Brooks had died knowing. The Red Creek Hotel had a back room where old ledgers went to be forgotten, stacked in crates behind crates, dust thick enough to write your name in. Abigail found reasons to clean that room 3 separate afternoons before she found what she was looking for. A ledger bound in cracked leather, tucked behind a crate of unused linens, hidden in a way that told her someone had wanted it hidden, not simply misplaced. She read it by the light of a hotel lamp she wasn't supposed to be using, after hours her heart climbing into her throat with every page she turned. 14 ranches, 14 names, 14 dates, 14 transfers to Victor Langford, each one following the death of the previous owner by no more than 11 days. Falls from horses. A fire. A drowning in a creek shallow enough to wade across. A hunting accident. The causes changed. The pattern never did. Samuel Brooks was the 14th name. Abigail closed the ledger with hands that had gone cold despite the summer night, and she understood with a clarity that terrified her that she was no longer simply a grieving widow trying to rebuild a life. She was the only person in Red Creek who knew the truth, and that made her the most dangerous person in it, whether she wanted to be or not. She copied the pages that night, working by candlelight until her fingers ached, hiding the copies inside the lining of her second petticoat, because she didn't trust a single drawer or trunk in that hotel. She didn't yet know that someone else in Red Creek had been hunting Victor Langford for 15 years, with a patience that made her 3 weeks of careful investigation look like a single held breath. Nathan Kane had ridden into the territory the first time when he was 21 years old, the same year Victor Langford's scheme took his family's ranch and his father's life inside 4 months. The story the county told was simple. Nathan's father, Ezra Kane, had signed a note he couldn't pay, then died in a fall, breaking a green horse nobody in the family had ever owned. The ranch passed to a land company that 3 transactions, and 2 years later, quietly became Victor Langford's. Nathan had been 21 and furious and stupid enough to ride into Victor's office with a gun on his hip and accusations on his tongue. And Victor had smiled at him with that same practiced sorrow he'd later show Abigail Carter, and said, "Grief makes a man see conspiracies and coincidence, son. I'm sorry for your loss. I truly am." 6 weeks after that visit, a wanted poster went up in 3 territories, with Nathan Kane's name on it, accused of a robbery he hadn't committed, backed by 2 witnesses who'd never once set foot near the bank in question. Nathan understood, standing in front of that poster, with his own face staring back at him, exactly how thoroughly Victor Langford could bury a man who threatened him. He'd spent 15 years since then living like the outlaw the poster made him, because it turned out to be the only way to move through the territory freely enough to keep watching, keep gathering, keep waiting for the day. The pattern finally cracked open wide enough for the whole territory to see. He'd been watching Samuel Brooks's ranch for 2 months before Samuel died. He'd ridden out the morning after and found boot prints on the north ridge that didn't match a fall from any horse. He'd found tucked inside Samuel's boot a scrap of paper with 3 words on it in Samuel's own hand. "She'll understand numbers." Nathan hadn't known what it meant until he saw Abigail Carter step off the stage 3 days later and watched Victor Langford meet her with that same rehearsed grief he'd used on a dozen widows before her. He'd followed her at a distance since, not close enough to be seen, close enough to know she'd started asking the mercantile clerk careful questions about land office hours, close enough to know she'd stayed 3 afternoons cleaning a back room she had no real reason to clean, close enough to know the night she carried a lamp into that room after the hotel had gone quiet that Abigail Carter had found something Victor Langford would kill to keep buried. He didn't approach her, not yet. A woman that careful, that smart, wouldn't trust a stranger with a bounty on his head, and rightly so. He watched instead from the shadow of the livery across the street. And he waited for the moment Victor realized what she knew. Because a man like Victor Langford, cornered, always made his move in public, where fear could do the work violence used to do for him. That moment came on a warm evening 3 weeks after Abigail's arrival, when Hollis Beam walked into the Red Creek Hotel and told her without any pretense of politeness that Mr. Langford wanted to see her in the saloon. Abigail knew the second she saw Hollis's face that something had shifted. She thought of the copies sewn into her petticoat and felt her pulse climb into her throat. "Tell Mr. Langford I'll be along shortly," she said, keeping her voice as steady as she could manage. "He said now," Hollis replied, and the way he said it left no room for another answer. She walked the short distance to the saloon with her spine straight and her hands folded because she had learned in 6 years of keeping books for men who didn't like being questioned that fear shown was fear used against you. The saloon was fuller than usual. Word traveled fast in a town that small, and something about the air that evening told half of Red Creek that whatever was about to happen was worth watching. Victor stood near the bar when she entered his coat, immaculate, his smile already arranged. "Miss Carter," he said loud enough for the room to hear. "I'm afraid a rather troubling matter has come to my attention." "Is that so?" Abigail said. "It seems—" Victor continued, turning slowly to address the room now rather than her. "That some items have gone missing from the hotel's records, financial documents, private papers belonging to me and to several respected men of this town." Murmurs moved through the crowd. Abigail felt every eye in the room turn toward her, and she made herself stand still under the weight of it. "I don't know what you're referring to, Mr. Langford." "Don't you?" Victor's voice hardened, the practiced sorrow finally cracking to show something colder underneath. "A woman with no family, no husband, no claim to anything in this town hired to clean my hotel out of charity, and now papers are missing. Forged papers I suspect meant to slander decent men who've done nothing but try to help you." "I never forged anything," Abigail said, and her voice to her own surprise didn't shake. "I found the truth, Mr. Langford. That's a different thing entirely from what you're accusing me of, and I think you know it." The room went absolutely silent. Victor's face didn't change, but something behind his eyes did, the flat, calculating look of a man deciding in real time how far he was willing to go. "Hollis," he said quietly. Hollis Beam crossed the floor in 4 long strides, and before Abigail could step back, before anyone in that crowded room lifted so much as a finger, his open hand caught her across the face hard enough to send her to the floor. The sound of it cracked through the saloon like a gunshot. Abigail hit the boards with her ears ringing and copper flooding her mouth, and through the daze she heard Victor's voice, calm again, terribly calm, telling the room that a thief who resisted arrest sometimes required firm handling. And wasn't it a shame, and didn't everyone agree it was best handled quietly? Nobody agreed out loud. Nobody disagreed either. 50 men in that room, and not one hand reached to help her up. Abigail pressed her palm flat against the floor and forced herself up onto her knees. Blood running warm down her chin, and somewhere underneath the pain and the ringing in her ears, a small, hard voice inside her refused to stay quiet. "Don't you dare stay down. Don't you dare let this be how it ends." She lifted her face toward the silent room, toward every man too afraid to move, and she said the only thing left in her. "Please," she whispered, blood on her lips. "Somebody help me." And that was the moment the saloon doors opened, and lantern light spilled across a man the whole territory had spent 15 years learning to fear, standing there with his hand not yet on his gun, his eyes already on her. Nathan Kane stepped through that doorway into a room full of men who'd stayed silent, and for the first time in 15 years, he wasn't walking in to hide from what Victor Langford had done to his family. He was walking in to finish it. Nathan didn't draw his gun. That was the thing that unsettled Hollis Beam more than any weapon could have. The outlaw everyone feared kept both hands loose at his sides, and somehow that made him more dangerous, not less. "You gonna help her up?" Nathan said. "Or am I gonna have to ask twice?" Hollis's eyes flicked to Victor. Victor gave nothing away, not yet, and in that silence, Hollis made his own decision, reaching down and hauling Abigail up by the arm, rougher than he needed to. Abigail bit back a cry and found her feet swaying, one hand pressed to her split lip. "Careful with her," Nathan said, and something in his voice dropped low enough that Hollis actually loosened his grip. Victor stepped forward, then smoothing his coat, rebuilding his composure piece by piece like a man setting a table back in order after it had been knocked over. "Mr. Kane," he said, "this is a private matter concerning theft from my hotel. I'm sure a man in your line of work understands the value of staying out of business that isn't his." "Funny," Nathan said. "I recall a private matter 15 years back. My family's ranch. My father dead in the dirt from a fall nobody witnessed. You stood in this same town and called that private business too." The room's temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees. A few men near the door found sudden interest in their boots. Victor's jaw tightened just barely. Ancient history and none of it true. Grief does strange things to a young man's memory. That's so. Nathan tilted his head, and there was nothing young or grieving in his face now, only a patience that had been sharpening itself for 15 years. "Then you won't mind if the circuit judge takes a look at your books when he rides through next month, since it's all just ancient history and grief talk." For half a second, so brief most of the room missed it, real fear crossed Victor Langford's face. Abigail saw it. She filed it away the way she filed away every number that didn't add up. "The judge," Victor said carefully, "isn't due for weeks. And whatever this woman claims to have found, I assure you will be shown for the forgery it is." "Then you got nothing to worry about," Nathan said. "Man with clean books never does." He turned, offering Abigail his arm, without asking whether she wanted it, and something about the plain, uncomplicated way he did it, like helping a hurt woman off a saloon floor, was the only obvious thing left to do in the world, made her take it before her pride could argue otherwise. "Come on, ma'am," he said quietly. "Let's get you somewhere safer than this." Nobody in the saloon moved to stop them. Nobody moved to help either. 50 men watched Nathan Kane walk a bleeding stranger out through the swinging doors, and every one of them would spend that night lying awake, wondering which side of history they'd just watched themselves stand on. Outside, the night air hit Abigail's split lip, like ice water, and the shock of it, the sheer relief of simply being outside that room, made her knees finally give. Nathan caught her before she hit the ground. "Easy," he said. "I got you. You're safe now." "I don't even know you," Abigail said, half laughing, half sobbing, the words coming out thick around her swollen mouth. "You just threatened the most powerful man in this town for a woman you've never met." "I know Victor Langford," Nathan said, and something old and tired moved behind his eyes. "That's enough to know whose side I'm on." He walked her the 2 blocks to the Mercantile, one arm steady under hers. And she was aware, even through the pain and the shaking that had finally caught up with her, of how carefully he matched his pace to her limp. How he angled his body slightly between her and the dark alley mouths. They passed the way a man does when protecting something without making a show of it. "Why?" Abigail asked when they'd stopped outside the Mercantile stairs. Would an outlaw with a bounty on his head walk straight into a room full of Victor Langford's men? Nathan looked at her for a long moment before he answered. "Because 15 years ago nobody walked in for my mother," he said. "I made myself a promise after that. Long as I'm breathing, that don't happen twice in front of me." Abigail's breath caught. She thought of Samuel Brooks dead on a ridge nobody witnessed, and she understood all at once that she wasn't the only person in Red Creek who'd lost someone to Victor Langford's careful arithmetic of death. "Your family," she said slowly. "He took your ranch too." "Everything," Nathan said. "Same story as your Samuel Brooks, near enough word for word. Different names, same hand doing the writing." The candle in the Mercantile's front window guttered. Somewhere down the street, a dog barked twice and went quiet. "I have copies," Abigail said suddenly, the words spilling out before caution could stop them. "Of the ledger. 14 ranches, 14 deaths, all matching his signature and his timing. I sewed them into my petticoat because I didn't trust a single drawer in that hotel." Nathan went very still. 14. "Yours would make 15. "No," Nathan said quietly. "Mine's already in there, under a different name. Victor bought my father's ranch through a company called Sterling Land Holdings. Ring a bell?" Abigail's mind raced back through pages she'd memorized by candlelight. "Sterling Land Holdings received 4 transfers. I thought it was a separate buyer." "It's him," Nathan said, "just wearing a different coat. He's done that trick 8-9 times over the years. Different company names, same crooked hand behind every one." Abigail felt something shift inside her chest. Not fear this time, but the sharp, clean click of numbers finally locking into place, the same feeling she used to get balancing a set of books that had refused to reconcile for weeks. "If I cross-reference the company names against the county filing dates," she said half to herself, "I could prove it's the same man behind every transfer, even the ones he thinks are buried." "You'd need the county filings," Nathan said. "Those are locked up in the land office. Victor's got the clerk in his pocket." "Then I'll need a way into that office that doesn't go through the clerk." Nathan almost smiled. It was the first almost smile she'd seen cross his face, and it changed him entirely, softened the hard lines around his mouth into something almost boyish. "You're not what I expected, Miss Carter," he said. "Neither are you, Mr. Kane." They stood there a moment longer than either of them meant to. The night quiet around them, the saloon's noise a distant murmur 2 blocks back, and something passed between them that neither one had a name for. Yet. Not trust exactly, not yet. But the first thread of it spun thin and careful in the dark. "You should get inside," Nathan said, finally stepping back. "Lock your door. I'll be close by tonight. Victor won't try anything with witnesses watching, but I don't trust him not to try something quiet. You're going to watch the Mercantile all night. Wouldn't be the first time I slept under open sky keeping an eye on something worth protecting." Abigail felt heat rise in her bruised cheeks that had nothing to do with the slap she'd taken. Thank you, Mr. Kane. For tonight. For all of it. Name's Nathan, he said. And you don't owe me thanks yet. We got a long way to go before this is finished. He was right, though neither of them yet understood how long or how much it would cost. Victor Langford did not sleep that night. He sat in his office above the bank with a bottle of good whiskey going warm and untouched at his elbow, and he thought with mounting fury about the widow who'd arrived 3 weeks ago, with nothing but a trunk and a dead man's letter, and who had somehow in that short a time become the single greatest threat to 15 years of careful, patient work. Hollis Beam stood near the door, hat in hand, waiting to be dismissed or used, whichever came first. She's got copies, Victor said finally. You understand that, don't you? A woman like that, careful as she's been, she wouldn't have shown her hand in that saloon unless she had something written down somewhere safe. We could search her room, Hollis offered, and find nothing because she's smarter than that. And now Nathan Kane is standing over her like a hired gun with a grudge, watching every move we make. Victor's fingers drummed once against the desk, sharp and controlled. No, we do this delicately. We discredit her before she reaches anyone who matters. Discredit her how? Victor's mouth curved into something that wasn't quite a smile. A grieving widow alone in a strange town, taking up with a wanted outlaw within her first month of arrival. Sharing his company after dark, unescorted. Red Creek is a small town, Hollis. Small towns love nothing so much as a scandal, and scandal is so much cleaner than murder. Folks already saw him walk her home tonight. Exactly, Victor said. By morning, half this town will be whispering about it without any help from us at all. All we need to do is make sure the whispers grow into something louder. Something that reaches the circuit judge before her ledger does. A woman with a ruined reputation makes a poor witness no matter what numbers she's got written down. It was Abigail would later think one of the cruelest moves Victor Langford ever made against her. Not violence this time, but something slower, meaner, designed to strip away the one thing a woman in her position had left to protect herself with. By the second morning, the whispers had already started. She felt it the moment she stepped into the mercantile to buy thread for mending her torn sleeve. The way conversation dropped half a register when she entered the way. Two women near the counter exchanged a look before turning pointedly toward the shelves. "Morning, Mrs. Carter," the mercantile owner's wife said, but her voice had gone thin and careful. The warmth of 3 weeks ago replaced by something colder. "Good morning," Abigail said, keeping her chin level despite the heat rising in her face. "I hear you had quite a night." The woman continued, not quite looking at her. "Walking out of the saloon on the arm of an outlaw. After dark, too." "He was helping me after I'd been struck by Mr. Langford's man," Abigail said evenly. "I don't believe there's scandal in a man helping a woman who couldn't stand on her own." Course, the woman said in a tone that suggested the opposite. "Only a decent woman ought to be careful about the company she keeps, especially a woman with no husband to speak for her." Abigail bought her thread and left without another word. Her hands shaking with a fury that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with recognizing with sickening clarity exactly what Victor Langford was doing to her. She found Nathan an hour later waiting near the edge of town, where the road curved toward the Brooks Ranch, his horse cropping grass while he leaned against a fence post like he had all the patience in the world. "He's turning the town against me," Abigail said without preamble. "Not with lies about the ledger, with lies about you and me." Nathan's expression didn't change, but something in his shoulders tightened. Figured he might try something like that. Man like Victor, he understands a woman's reputation is worth more to her in a town like this than any pile of evidence. "I don't care what they say about me," Abigail said, though her voice shook slightly on the words. "But if they stop trusting me before the judge arrives, everything I've gathered means nothing. A discredited witness is worse than no witness at all." "Then we don't wait for the judge," Nathan said. "What do you mean?" "I mean there's a federal land surveyor due through Red Creek in 9 days checking boundary claims after last year's territory resurvey. He answers to Washington, not to Victor Langford or anybody. Victor's bought in this county. If we can get the ledger and the county filings in front of him before Victor finishes burying you in gossip, he's obligated to report irregularities straight up the chain. Wouldn't need the circuit judge at all, not right away. Abigail felt something like hope, thin and fragile, thread through her chest. You know a federal surveyor's schedule. I make it my business to know things that might matter someday, Nathan said. 15 years is a long time to spend watching one man. You learn things. 9 days, Abigail repeated. That's not much time to get into a locked land office. No, Nathan agreed. It ain't, which is why we're not going in the front door. That night, for the first time, Abigail understood exactly how far outside the law Nathan Kane had learned to live, and how uncomfortably necessary that skill had suddenly become to her. The land office sat between the bank and the sheriff's office, a modest building with a single window and a door lock that Nathan assured her had been installed by the same traveling locksmith who'd fitted half the buildings in 3 territories, and who happened to use the same 3 lock designs for every job he did. You've done this before, Abigail said, watching him crouch at the door with a thin metal pick in hand. More times than I'm proud of, Nathan admitted. Most of it chasing paper trails just like this one. County filings, land office records, bank ledgers. Victor's not the first man I've had to catch this way, just the one that matters most. The lock gave with a soft click. Inside the office smelled of dust and old paper moonlight cutting thin silver lines through the single window across stacks of filing boxes. We've got maybe 2 hours before the night watchman makes his second round, Nathan said. You know what you're looking for better than I do. Tell me where to start. Abigail moved through the boxes with the quick, sure hands of a woman who'd spent 6 years finding truth buried in numbers, calling out dates and names, while Nathan pulled folders and held them to the moonlight for her to scan. Sterling Land Holdings, she murmured, flipping through a folder. Here. Filed the same week as the Brooks transfer. And here Cross County Development filed 3 months before that same notary seal. Same seal. Nathan leaned closer, and for a moment, his shoulder brushed hers close enough that she felt the warmth of him even in the cold office air. Look, she said, pointing to the wax impression at the bottom corner. A chip in the seal here along the edge. Same flaw on both documents. Whoever notarized Sterling Land's transfer notarized Cross Counties 2 months apart under 2 different company names. Curtis Yoder, Nathan said grimly. Curtis Yoder, Abigail confirmed. The same man who supposedly witnessed my note the same day he was witnessing a transfer clear across town. He's not just careless, he's Victor's man, signing whatever crosses his desk. They worked in near silence, after that the discovery humming between them like electricity, each new folder confirming what they already knew, and adding fresh names to a list that had already grown far too long. It was nearly midnight when Nathan went suddenly still, his hand freezing over a folder marked with a date 11 years past. What is it? Abigail whispered. This one, Nathan said, and his voice had gone rough in a way she hadn't heard from him before. Kane. Ezra Kane. My father's name. Abigail moved to his side without thinking, her hand coming to rest lightly on his forearm. You don't have to look at this tonight, she said gently. We can come back for it. No, Nathan said. I've waited 15 years to see what's actually written here, instead of what I remember being told. I'm not walking away now. He opened the folder with hands that weren't quite steady, and Abigail watched something break open behind his eyes as he read. Not tears, not quite, but something older and more exhausted than tears, the particular grief of a man finally holding proof of what he'd always known, but never been allowed to say out loud. There's a second signature here, he said slowly. Witnessing the transfer. Not Curtis Yoder. Somebody else. Abigail leaned in to read the name and felt her own breath catch. Samuel Brooks, she whispered. Nathan looked up at her, something raw and disbelieving crossing his face. You're Samuel Brooks. He would have been young then, 20 maybe, but it's the same hand I've seen in his letters. Abigail's mind raced, connecting threads she hadn't known existed. Nathan, what if Samuel didn't just discover Victor's scheme recently? What if he witnessed the very first transfer all those years ago, and Victor kept him quiet somehow, and only recently Samuel decided he couldn't stay silent any longer? That would explain the note in his boot, Nathan said half to himself. What note? The morning after he died, I found his body first. Before the sheriff, before anybody official. There was a scrap of paper tucked in his boot. 3 words. She'll understand numbers. Nathan's jaw tightened. I thought it meant you'd figure out the ledger once you got here. Maybe it meant more than that. Maybe he meant for you to find this too. Abigail felt the weight of it settle over her. Not just grief for a man she'd never met in person, but the terrible quiet courage of someone who'd spent years complicit in a crime he couldn't undo alone, and who'd finally, at the cost of his own life, tried to make it right. He was going to testify, she said softly. Wasn't he? That's why Victor killed him. Not because of me. Because Samuel finally decided to tell the truth. And then you showed up, Nathan said, asking the exact questions Victor spent 15 years making sure nobody asked. No wonder he panicked enough to come after you in public. You're not just some widow he can push around Abigail. You're the thing he's been afraid of since the day my father died. It was the first time he'd used her given name, and something in the way he said it, quiet and certain, made her chest ache in a way that had nothing to do with grief. They didn't have time to sit with the feeling. A sound outside boots on gravel, slow and deliberate, snapped them both back to the danger of where they stood. Watchman, Nathan breathed. Early. Someone must have changed his route. Or someone told him to change it, Abigail said, her pulse spiking. Nathan doused the moonlight-catching folder against his chest and pulled her back into the shadow between 2 filing cabinets, close enough that she could feel his heartbeat through his shirt steady, despite the danger, like a man who'd learned long ago how to keep calm when everything in him wanted to run. The watchman's lantern swung past the window, pausing. Abigail held her breath. The light moved on. Boots faded back down the street. It was nearly a full minute before either of them breathed easy again. And in that minute, standing pressed together in the dark with stolen truth clutched between them, something shifted in the air that neither one dared name yet. We should go, Nathan whispered finally, though he didn't move right away. We should. Abigail agreed, though she didn't move either. It was Nathan who broke first, stepping back, clearing his throat roughly. Copy what you need. We can't take the originals. Victor would know within the hour, and then we'd lose whatever time we've got left before the surveyor arrives. Abigail worked quickly after that, copying names and dates onto a scrap of paper by the thin edge of moonlight, her hand cramping before she finished. But she didn't stop until she had every filing that mattered. Sterling Land Holdings, Cross County Development. 4 other company names Victor had hidden behind over the years, and beneath every one of them, the same chipped notary seal, the same pattern of death and transfer repeating like a wound that never healed. They slipped out the way they'd come. The lock clicking closed behind them, and walked the darkened street back toward the Mercantile in silence that felt for the first time since the Saloon almost peaceful. 9 days, Abigail said, finally breaking the quiet. 9 days. Nathan agreed. We'll need more than filings, though. We'll need someone willing to speak against him out loud. Filings prove the pattern. A living voice proves the man. You mean a witness? I mean someone in this town brave enough to say what everybody already whispers, but nobody's dared say to a judge's face. Nathan's expression turned grim. Victor's had this town scared quiet for 15 years. That kind of fear doesn't break easy. It broke a little in the saloon, Abigail said. When you walked in, nobody moved to help me, but nobody moved to stop you either. Fear cracking a little ain't the same as fear breaking, Nathan said. We're going to need more than one man's reputation to finish this. We're going to need the whole town to remember what it feels like to stand up. They reached the Mercantile stairs, and this time Nathan didn't let go of her arm quite as readily as he had the first night. Abigail, he said, and the way he said her name again, careful, deliberate, made her chest tighten. What Victor's saying about us, the scandal, the whispers. I want you to know I never meant to bring that kind of trouble on you. If you want me to keep my distance in public, at least until this is finished, no. Abigail said quicker than she meant to, and then softer. No. Let them whisper. I spent 6 years married to a good man who never once made me feel like I mattered beyond keeping his books balanced and his house quiet. 3 weeks in this town and you're the first person who's looked at me like what I think actually matters." She swallowed hard. "I'd rather be talked about standing beside a man of honor than respected standing beside men who let me bleed on a saloon floor." Nathan looked at her for a long moment, something unguarded crossing his face in the dark. "Careful, ma'am," he said quietly. "Talk like that, a man could start hoping for things he's got no business hoping for. Wanted man, remember, 15 years running, not much of a future to offer anybody." "Maybe that changes," Abigail said, "once the truth comes out." "Maybe it does," Nathan said. And for a moment, standing in the dark, with stolen evidence between them and a town full of danger at their backs, it almost felt possible. He left her at the stairs with a promise to return before dawn, and Abigail climbed to her small room above the mercantile and sat by her window long after his footsteps faded, watching the dark street below, thinking not about ledgers or dead men or Victor Langford's careful cruelty, but about the particular way Nathan Kane had said her name like it was something worth protecting all on its own. She did not know sitting there in the quiet that Victor Langford already knew about the land office. The watchman who'd nearly caught them had not changed his route by accident. He'd changed it on Hollis Beam's order, sent specifically to search the office on suspicion that someone had been inside. And though he hadn't caught them in the act, he'd noticed the next morning that the Kane folder sat half an inch out of place, from where it always had dust disturbed along its edge, in a way that told a careful eye exactly what had happened. Victor sat with that information for a full day before he acted on it, turning it over the way he turned over every piece of a scheme before he moved a single piece. "They know about the company names," he said finally to Hollis late in the evening, the two of them alone in his office above the bank. "Sterling, Cross County, all of it. Which means they know it's the same hand behind every death." "You want me to deal with them?" Hollis asked, his meaning plain enough. "Not yet," Victor said. "Kill an outlaw with a bounty on his head, folks might not ask many questions. Kill a grieving widow who's already been seen beaten in public, and suddenly this town that stayed quiet for 15 years starts asking exactly the kind of questions I can't afford." He drummed his fingers against the desk thinking. "No, we need something cleaner. Something that removes the ledger and the witness both without leaving Nathan Kane a martyr to rally around." Such as, Victor's smile when it came was thin and cold. "Curtis Yoder's been getting nervous. A man that nervous is a liability. But a nervous man properly frightened in the other direction makes an excellent witness against the people he's afraid of." He leaned back in his chair. "We're going to accuse Nathan Kane of theft. The ledger stolen from my hotel by an outlaw with a documented history of robbery. And we're going to have Curtis Yoder swear he witnessed it happen. Folks might not believe that, not after the saloon. Folks believe whatever frightens them enough to stop asking questions," Victor said. "Fear is a far better tool than truth ever was, Hollis. It always has been in this town. I intend to remind everyone of that fact before the week is through." 2 days later, a wanted notice went up outside the sheriff's office. Fresh ink still tacky in the morning sun, accusing Nathan Kane of theft and assault against Victor Langford's household, with a reward posted for information leading to his capture. Abigail read it standing in the street with her heart in her throat, and beside her an old rancher named Elias Pruitt, a quiet man who'd said perhaps 10 words to her since her arrival, spat into the dirt and shook his head. "Man's been running this town scared for 15 years, Elias said low enough that only she could hear. "I remember when the Kane boy's father died. Wasn't no accident. Half this town knew it and said nothing same as we're saying nothing now." Abigail turned to him slowly. "You remember." "Old enough to remember plenty," Elias said. "Young enough to still be afraid of what remembering costs me." He looked at her for a long moment, something shifting behind his weathered eyes. "You're the first person in 15 years fool enough to poke this snake, missus. Man beside you last night, he ain't lying about what happened to his family. I'd stake my ranch on it. Would you say so to a judge?" Elias's jaw worked old fear, warring with something newer. Something that had cracked open a little in that saloon 3 nights ago and hadn't quite closed back up. "Ask me again," he said finally, when it's closer to time. Man my age, I got grandchildren in this town. Can't just go charging in reckless. But I ain't forgot what I saw 15 years back either. And I ain't forgot what I saw in that saloon 3 nights ago when a wanted outlaw walked in for a stranger while 50 men who called themselves decent stood there and did nothing. It wasn't a yes. But it wasn't a no either, and Abigail understood walking away that something in Red Creek had begun slowly, painfully to shift. She found Nathan that evening at their usual meeting place near the fence line, and the moment she saw his face, she knew he'd already seen the notice. "They're calling it theft now," he said grimly. "Curtis Yoders agreed to swear he saw me steal the ledger from Victor's hotel with my own hands. Sheriff's got no choice but to come looking for me whether he believes it or not." "Then we go to the surveyor now," Abigail said, "before it gets worse. He's not due for another 6 days. And even if we reached him early, a wanted man walking up to a federal official with stolen county filings in his pocket doesn't exactly inspire confidence, Abigail. It'll look exactly like Victor wants it to look, a desperate outlaw and his conspirator trying to save their own skins." "Then what do we do?" Nathan was quiet for a long moment, something hard and resolved settling into his expression. "We need Curtis Yoder to recant," he said, "publicly, before this goes any further. A frightened man's lie only holds as long as he's more scared of Victor than the truth. We need to give him a reason to be more scared of what happens if he keeps lying." "That sounds dangerous," Abigail said carefully. "Everything about this has been dangerous since the day you stepped off that stage," Nathan said. "Question is whether we let Victor set the terms of it or whether we start setting our own." That night, for the first time since Abigail had arrived in Red Creek, it rained a hard, sudden downpour that sent most of the town scurrying indoors. Streets emptying, fast lantern light dimming behind shuttered windows. Nathan found Curtis Yoder exactly where he expected to, in the back room of the land office, alone going over paperwork, with the particular nervous energy of a man trying to convince himself he'd made the right choice. He didn't draw his gun when he stepped through the door. He didn't need to. Curtis Yoder went pale and dropped his pen the moment he looked up and saw who was standing in the doorway. "Kane," Curtis stammered. "I ain't got no quarrel with you." "Funny," Nathan said, closing the door behind him with quiet finality. "Seeing as you just told the sheriff I stole a ledger with my own 2 hands. Kind of a serious quarrel to start with a man accusing him of a crime he didn't commit." "Victor made me do it," Curtis blurted, the fear cracking through him faster than Nathan had expected. "He said if I didn't sign the statement, he'd call in the loan on my shop, and I'd lose everything my family would have nowhere by say. I know how Victor operates," Nathan said, his voice gentling slightly, though his eyes stayed hard. 15 years I've watched him do it to half this county. Question is, Curtis, how many more years you plan on letting him own you before you decide your own conscience is worth more than his convenience?" Curtis's hands were shaking now. Fear and shame tangled together in his face. "What do you want from me?" "The truth," Nathan said simply. "Written down, signed, and held safe until it's time to use it. Not tonight. Not tomorrow. When the moment's right, you tell the truth about every document you've notarized for that man, every seal you've faked, every witness signature you've forged on his say-so. 14 ranches, Curtis. 14 dead men. Your hands on paper next to every single one of them, whether you meant for it to be or not." "He'll kill me," Curtis whispered. "Maybe," Nathan said. "Or maybe when this town finally sees the truth laid out plain, they remember you were the man brave enough to help bring it, instead of the coward who helped bury it. Your choice which story gets told about you, Curtis. But you're going to have to choose soon. Time's about run out for standing in the middle." Curtis sat there a long moment, rain hammering the roof above them, his whole body trembling with the weight of a decision 15 years in the making. "I'll write it down," he said finally, so quietly Nathan almost missed it. "God help me, I'll write it down." It was not Nathan understood walking back out into the rain of victory yet. A frightened man's promise could crumble as fast as it was made, especially with Victor Langford's threats still hanging over his family. But it was a crack in a wall that had stood unbroken for 15 years, and cracks, Nathan had learned long ago, had a way of spreading once they started. He found Abigail waiting under the mercantile awning, soaked through, despite the shelter, unable to stay away from news of how the confrontation had gone. "Well?" she asked, searching his face. "He'll write a confession," Nathan said. "Whether he'll have the nerve to hand it over when the moment comes, that's a different question." "It's a start," Abigail said. "It's a start." Nathan agreed, and something in the way he looked at her, then rain running down both their faces. The danger around them, thick as the storm itself, made the distance between them feel suddenly very small. "Abigail," he said low, "whatever happens when this is finished, win or lose, cleared name or not, I need you to know that riding into that saloon 3 nights ago is the first thing I've done in 15 years that felt like more than just running from what Victor took from me. Felt like finally running towards something instead." Abigail's breath caught rain and cold, forgotten entirely. "Nathan," whatever she meant to say was lost, because at that exact moment a gunshot cracked through the rain-soaked night, somewhere close, somewhere near the land office they'd just left, and both of them went rigid at once, the fragile warmth between them shattering instantly into fear. "Curtis," Nathan breathed. They ran together through the rain, toward the sound. Abigail's skirts, heavy and dragging Nathan half a step ahead, his hand instinctively moving to the gun at his hip, for the first time since he'd walked into that saloon 3 nights before. They found the land office door standing open, rain blowing in sideways across the threshold, and Curtis Yoder's confession. The paper he'd only just agreed, trembling to write, lying torn and scattered across the floor, ink already running and bleeding into illegible streaks under the storm pouring through the open door. Of Curtis Yoder himself, there was no sign at all. Nathan's jaw tightened to stone, and Abigail felt something cold and certain settle over her, the understanding that whatever fragile progress they'd made that night had just been answered swift and brutal by a man who had spent 15 years proving he would burn down anything, anyone, rather than let the truth stand in daylight. "He knows," Abigail whispered. "Victor knows everything we've done." "Then we're out of time to be careful," Nathan said, his voice gone hard and flat in a way she hadn't heard from him before. "Victor just showed his hand, means he's scared, and a scared man makes mistakes." He crouched to gather the ruined scraps of Curtis's confession, salvaging what little the rain and ink hadn't destroyed his movements quick and controlled, despite the fury burning plain beneath his calm. "We need to move faster than we planned," he said. "Faster and smarter before Victor decides a missing land office clerk is the least of what he's willing to do to keep this buried." Abigail knelt beside him in the rain, gathering what pages remained, her hands steady, despite the fear coursing through her, because she understood now, with a clarity sharper than any ledger had ever given her, exactly how much was truly at stake. Not just a ranch, not just a name cleared, but every life Victor Langford had already taken, and every life he still meant to take before this was finished. "Then let's move," she said, "whatever it costs." Outside, the storm showed no sign of breaking, and somewhere in Red Creek, in a locked room, or a shallow grave, or a place neither of them yet dared imagine Curtis Yoder's fate, hung suspended between the truth he'd almost found the courage to tell, and the silence that had swallowed 14 men before him. Nathan found the first clue within the hour, kneeling in the mud behind the land office, where wagon tracks cut fresh grooves through the rain-softened ground, heading east toward the old grain depot at the edge of town. "Depot's been empty for years," he said, rising fast. "Nobody'd take a man there unless they meant to keep him quiet a good long while. Or unless they didn't mean for anyone to find him at all," Abigail said, and the thought settled cold in her stomach. They moved through the storm together, Nathan's hand closing around hers, without either of them deciding it should happen, just the plain need to keep from losing each other in the dark and rain. The depot sat black and hulking against the clouds, its doors chained but not locked well enough to keep out a man who'd spent 15 years learning how doors worked when they weren't meant to open. Inside, they found Curtis Yoder bound to a support post, a gag pulled tight across his mouth, his eyes wide and terrified above it, but alive. Alive mattered more than anything else in that moment. "Easy," Nathan said, already working the ropes loose. Easy now, Curtis. We got you. Curtis gasped the second the gag came free, air heaving into his lungs like a man surfacing from deep water. Hollis, he choked out. Hollis Beam grabbed me right after you left. Said Victor wanted me somewhere I couldn't talk to nobody till after the surveyors come and gone. Said if I so much as whispered a word before, then my shop burns and my family goes with it. You're safe now, Abigail said, crouching beside him, her hand steady on his shoulder, despite the tremor still running through her own body. But we need you to understand something, Curtis. Victor's not going to stop. Not with threats, not with this. He'll keep coming until somebody stops him first. Curtis's eyes flicked between them. Fear and something else. Something that looked almost like relief at finally being asked instead of threatened. I'll do it, he whispered. I'll sign whatever you need. Just not here, not tonight. I need to get my wife and boy somewhere safe first. Victor finds out I've been taken, and I'm still breathing, he'll go after them next. Then that's step one, Nathan said. We get your family somewhere Victor can't reach, and then you write everything down clean, signed, ready to hand a judge or a federal surveyor the moment either one sets foot in this town. It was nearly dawn by the time they'd moved Curtis's wife and young son to the Brooks Ranch, the one property in Red Creek Victor no longer had any legal claim to disturb, at least not without drawing exactly the kind of attention he'd spent years avoiding. Abigail stood in the ranch house that had once belonged to a man she'd never met in person, watching a frightened family settle into borrowed beds, and felt the strange heavy weight of purpose settling over her. Not just fighting for her own name anymore, but for everyone Victor Langford had ever silenced. Nathan found her on the porch as the sky began to gray at the edges. You should sleep, he said. Even an hour. Can't, Abigail admitted. Every time I close my eyes I see that saloon floor. Or Curtis tied to that post. I keep thinking about how close we came to losing him. Nathan settled onto the porch step beside her close enough that their shoulders nearly touched. 15 years I've been at this alone, he said quietly. Watching, waiting, gathering pieces nobody else believed mattered. Never had anybody to share the weight of it with. He glanced at her, something unguarded in his tired eyes. Tonight's the first time in a long while it didn't feel like carrying it alone. Abigail felt her throat tighten. I never asked to be part of any of this. I just wanted a quiet life. A husband. A home. She looked out at the graying sky. But I don't think I could walk away now, even if I wanted to. Not after what he's done. Not after what he's still trying to do. Nobody's asking you to walk away, Nathan said. Just asking you to survive long enough to see it through. They sat in silence a moment, the kind of silence that had grown comfortable between them despite everything, and Abigail let herself, just for that stretch of gray morning light, lean her shoulder against his. The peace didn't last. By mid-morning, word had already spread through Red Creek that Curtis Yoder had gone missing overnight. Victor made certain of that himself, spinning the story before anyone else could. Standing in the street outside the bank, with a crowd gathering around him. I fear the worst. Victor said, his voice heavy with manufactured grief. Curtis was a nervous man prone to guilt over debts he couldn't manage. I only hope he hasn't done something drastic to himself. Abigail, standing at the edge of the gathering crowd, felt fury climb hot into her throat. He was laying groundwork preparing the town to believe Curtis Yoder had either fled in shame or taken his own life, either story convenient enough to bury whatever truth Curtis might still tell. That's a lie, she said before she could stop herself, her voice carrying clear across the street. Every head turned. Victor's eyes found hers cold and sharp beneath his practiced sorrow. Miss Carter, he said. I understand you've had a difficult few days. Perhaps it would be wise to rest rather than make accusations in the street. Curtis Yoder was taken, Abigail said, stepping forward despite the way her heart hammered against her ribs. Bound and gagged in the old grain depot. I imagine if the sheriff cared to look, he'd find rope fibers matching exactly what was used to hold him there. I imagine he'd also find whoever did it left tracks a blind man could follow. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Victor's composure flickered just barely. But Abigail saw it, and so she realized did several others watching closely. Serious accusations, Victor said, recovering fast from a woman already under suspicion of theft and forgery herself. I'd be careful, Miss Carter, about which direction you point fingers given your own circumstances. My circumstances, Abigail said, are that I found the truth about 14 dead men, and you've spent every day since trying to bury me under it, instead of answering for what you've done. The crowd's murmur grew louder now, uneasy shifting. Elias Pruitt stood near the front, his weathered face unreadable, but his eyes fixed hard on Victor in a way that hadn't been there 3 weeks before. Victor's jaw tightened. He hadn't expected open defiance, not this soon, not in broad daylight with half the town watching. This conversation is finished, he said curtly, turning to go. It isn't, came another voice, and Nathan stepped out from the edge of the crowd, having watched the entire exchange with his hand resting easy near his belt, not threatening, simply present. Not until Curtis Yoder's found safe, and the man who took him answers for it. Victor's eyes narrowed at Nathan. You seem remarkably certain about details only the guilty party would know, Kane. I seem certain, Nathan said, because I'm the one who found him. Alive, no thanks to you or your man Hollis Beam. The crowd's murmur turned to outright noise. Now questions overlapping, and Abigail watched something she hadn't seen since arriving in Red Creek. The fear that had held this town silent for 15 years, beginning finally visibly to crack under the weight of too many witnesses, seeing too much truth at once. Victor didn't stay to argue further. He turned and walked back toward the bank, his composure just barely intact, but Abigail saw the tension in his shoulders, the stiff, controlled fury of a man who understood for the first time in years that the ground beneath him had genuinely begun to shift. That night, Victor summoned Hollis to his office with none of his usual calm. They're gaining ground, he said, pacing now, instead of sitting, a rare break in his composure. The whole town watched Kane call me a liar in the street this morning, and nobody rushed to my defense. 15 years, Hollis. 15 years of careful work, and it's unraveling in a matter of days because of one widow with a head for figures. We could leave, Hollis offered. Take what's liquid ride for the territory line before the surveyor arrives, and abandon everything I've built. Victor's voice cracked sharp through the room. No, we finish this the way we should have finished it the first night. Quietly, permanently, and in a manner that leaves no one alive to testify against me. Hollis hesitated. Killing an outlaw's one thing. Killing a woman the whole town's seen beaten and defended, that's different, Victor. Folks are already watching close. Then we don't kill her in town, Victor said. We draw them both out, somewhere isolated. The old Brooks Ranch, perhaps fitting given how this whole mess started there. An accident. A fire, maybe the kind that takes a house and everyone sleeping in it before anyone can raise an alarm. His eyes had gone flat, calculating in a way that made even Hollis's stomach turn slightly. Curtis Yoder's family is staying there now, isn't it? All the better. Clean up every loose thread at once. Hollis said nothing, but something in his silence carried the first note of doubt he'd shown in 15 years of loyal service, a small crack that Victor, consumed by his own mounting desperation, failed entirely to notice. Abigail learned of the plan by pure chance 2 days later, when Elias Pruitt found her at the Brooks Ranch with news that had clearly cost him considerable courage to deliver. My grandson works stable duty at the bank, Elias said, voice low despite them being alone on the porch. Overheard Hollis Beam talking to 2 of Victor's other men last night. Talk of a fire. Talk of this ranch, missus. I don't know when, but it's coming, and coming soon. Abigail's blood ran cold. The Yoder family is sleeping in this house right now. I know it, Elias said. That's why I rode out soon as I heard. Figured you and Kane needed warning more than you needed me staying quiet and safe. Thank you, Elias, Abigail said, gripping his weathered hand. I know what it cost you to come here. Man my age starts wondering what kind of world his grandchildren will grow up in, Elias said gruffly, clearly uncomfortable with gratitude. Kind where everybody stays quiet, and men like Langford own everything, or kind where somebody finally says enough. I know which one I'd rather leave behind. Nathan arrived within the hour, and the plan Elias had overheard settled into his expression like ice. He's done waiting, Nathan said grimly. Man's desperate now, which makes him dangerous in a way careful patience never did. We can't sit here waiting for a fire to prove he means what he says. Then we move first, Abigail said. Get the Yoder family somewhere else tonight. And Curtis, if he's willing, if he's ready, we take his signed confession and we take everything we've gathered straight to the sheriff. Publicly. Before Victor can strike again. Sheriff's been paid off for years, Nathan warned. No guarantee he'll act on any of it. Maybe not, Abigail said. But if we do it in front of the whole town the way Victor did to me in that saloon, then it doesn't matter whether the sheriff acts alone. The town will see it. The town will remember it. And Victor won't be able to bury it quiet anymore, not with that many witnesses. Nathan looked at her for a long moment, something fierce and proud moving behind his tired eyes. You've got more nerve than most men I've ridden with, you know that? I've got 14 dead men's names memorized, Abigail said. And I intend to make sure Victor Langford hears every single one of them spoken out loud before this is finished. They moved the Yoder family to the sheriff's own boarding house that evening, under cover of dusk, Curtis clutching a newly rewritten confession pressed flat inside his coat. His hands steadier now than they'd been in the depot, fear slowly giving way to something like resolve. Tomorrow, Curtis said as they settled his family into the small room. I'll stand in that saloon tomorrow, in front of whoever gathers, and I'll say every word of it out loud. I'm done being afraid of a man who's killed 14 people and would have let me be the 15th without blinking. You sure? Nathan asked. Once it's said, there's no taking it back. Victor won't forgive it easy. I've spent 15 years signing my name to lies that killed good men. Curtis said, his voice cracking but not breaking. I'd rather die telling the truth than keep living telling lies. That night, unable to sleep, despite bone-deep exhaustion, Abigail found Nathan keeping watch on the ranch house porch rifle across his knees, eyes fixed on the dark tree line. You should rest, she said, echoing his words from 2 nights before. Can't. He admitted, a faint, tired smile touching his mouth. Told you the same thing, didn't I? Guess it's easier to say than to do. She sat beside him, the night quiet around them. The danger they both knew was coming, hanging unspoken in the air. Tomorrow could go very wrong, she said. Could, Nathan agreed. But it could also be the day 15 years of waiting finally means something. He glanced at her, his expression softening. Whatever happens tomorrow, Abigail, I need you to know, riding into your life the way I did, threat and violence, and a stranger's blood on the saloon floor, that ain't how I pictured meeting somebody worth caring about. But I wouldn't trade a single moment of these past weeks, dangerous as they've been, for all the quiet years I spent running alone before you got here. Abigail felt her breath catch the weight of everything between them, finally rising to the surface. Nathan, don't, he said gently, though not unkindly. Not tonight. Whatever I feel, whatever this is between us, it deserves better than being said in the middle of all this danger, with Victor Langford still breathing free, and a fire threat still hanging over both our heads. Once this is finished, once you're safe, and my name's cleared or not, I'll say it proper. Till then, just know it's there. Abigail reached over and took his hand, saying nothing, because sometimes silence carried more truth than words ever could, and they sat together through the last hours of darkness, watching the tree line, waiting for whatever the morning would bring. Morning brought Victor Langford's move before either of them expected it. Word reached the ranch just past sunrise. Hollis Beam and 3 other men had ridden into town at first light and taken up position outside the sheriff's boarding house, watching, waiting, their intent plain enough to anyone who understood what Victor was capable of. He knows we moved the Yoder family, Nathan said grimly, watching from the ranch house window as a rider brought the news. He's trying to isolate Curtis before he can speak. Then we go now, Abigail said. Before Victor decides watching isn't enough. They rode into Red Creek together, Curtis and his family under careful guard between them, the whole town seeming to sense, even before they arrived, that something enormous was about to break open. By the time they reached the saloon, the same saloon where Abigail had bled on the floor 3 weeks before, where Nathan had first walked through those doors and changed everything, a crowd had already begun to gather, drawn by whispers and rumor and the particular electric tension that precedes a storm. Victor stood near the bar when they entered, Hollis at his shoulder, and for the first time since Abigail had met him, real uncertainty showed plain on his face. "This is quite a gathering," Victor said, his voice carrying the strain of a man trying desperately to hold on to composure he no longer fully possessed. "Come to make more wild accusations, Miss Carter." "No," Abigail said, stepping forward, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "I've come to let someone else speak for a change." She turned to Curtis Yoder, who stood pale but resolute beside her, the confession clutched in his shaking hands. "Go on, Curtis," she said softly. "Tell them." Curtis's voice wavered at first, barely audible over the murmur of the crowd, but it steadied as he spoke, growing stronger with every sentence, like a man finally setting down a weight he'd carried far too long. 15 years, he began. "I've been notarizing false documents for Victor Langford, signing witness names that were never present, faking transfers on ranches that belonged to men who died sudden convenient deaths within days of signing debts they never truly owed." His voice cracked, but he pushed through it. 14 ranches, 14 dead men. Every single transfer bears my seal, and every single seal was a lie I told, because I was too afraid of what Victor Langford would do to my family if I refused. The saloon had gone utterly silent, the kind of silence that felt like the whole room holding its breath at once. "That's a preposterous accusation," Victor said, but his voice had lost its earlier confidence, thin now brittle. "A man who abandons his post and vanishes for 2 days, suddenly reappearing with wild claims. Who would believe such a thing?" "I would," Nathan said, stepping forward. "Because my father, Ezra Kane, was one of those 14 men, and I've spent 15 years gathering proof of exactly what Curtis just confessed to." He set the copied ledger pages on the bar, spreading them out for the room to see, and beside them, Abigail added her own careful notes, the chipped notary seal, the impossible timelines, the pattern repeating across company names that all traced back inevitably, unmistakably, to Victor Langford's own hand. "Sterling Land Holdings," Abigail said, pointing to each entry in turn, her voice ringing clear through the silent room. "Cross County Development, 4 other names besides, all different masks, all the same man beneath them, all the same pattern of death and transfer over and over for 15 years while this town stayed silent and afraid." The crowd's murmur rose now, disbelief giving way to something sharper, angrier, as name after name was read aloud. Each one a person some of them had known, had drunk with, had buried without ever asking the questions that should have been asked from the start. Victor's composure finally visibly shattered. "Enough," he snapped, and something cold and desperate entered his voice. "Hollis." Hollis Beam's hand moved toward his gun, and for one terrible suspended moment, Abigail thought the whole confrontation would end in the very violence they'd spent weeks trying to expose without triggering. But Hollis didn't draw. He stood frozen, his hand hovering near his holster, his eyes moving across the crowd, across Curtis Yoder's trembling but resolute face, across Abigail and Nathan, standing united against everything Victor Langford represented. And something in him, 15 years of loyalty, finally weighed against 15 years of buried guilt, broke. "No?" Hollis said quietly, lowering his hand. "No, Victor. I've followed your orders a long time, stayed quiet about things I shouldn't have, but I ain't drawing on an unarmed man and a beaten woman in front of this whole town. Not anymore." Victor stared at him, disbelief and fury warring across his face. "You'd turn on me now, after everything." "I'm not turning on you," Hollis said. "I'm just done being part of what you've been doing. There's a difference, and I should have seen it 15 years ago." The room erupted, then voices rising all at once, Elias Pruitt stepping forward to add his own memory of Ezra Kane's death. Another rancher recalling a suspicious fire from years past, name after name rising from the crowd, like a dam finally breaking after 15 years of held-back water. Victor Langford stood in the center of it all, the man who had ruled Red Creek through fear for 15 years, watching his empire collapse in real time under the weight of truths he'd spent a decade and a half trying to bury. "This is madness," he said, But nobody was listening anymore. I built this town. I gave half of you your livelihoods, your loans, You gave us fear, Elias Pruitt cut in his voice, carrying clear and hard through the saloon. Dressed up as kindness. But we all knew deep down, didn't we? We all knew something was wrong every time a good man died sudden, and his land ended up in your hands. We just didn't have the courage to say it till now. Victor's eyes swept the room, searching for any face still loyal, any hand still willing to defend him, and found none. Even the men who'd once drunk at his expense, who'd owed him favors and debts, stood silent now, their silence no longer protecting him, but condemning him. In that moment of total exposure, cornered and desperate, Victor did the only thing left available to a man who had built his entire life on control, and now had none left. He lunged for the ledger on the bar, perhaps meaning to destroy it, perhaps simply acting on pure animal panic, and in doing so, his coat fell open just enough to reveal the small pistol hidden beneath it. Nathan moved before conscious thought could catch up to instinct, closing the distance between them in 2 fast strides, catching Victor's wrist before the pistol could clear its holster, twisting hard enough that Victor cried out, and the weapon clattered uselessly to the floorboards. "It's over, Victor." Nathan said, his voice low and final, pinning the older man against the bar with an ease that spoke to 15 years of hard-won strength. 15 years, you've been the only one in this room allowed to be afraid of nothing. That's finished now. Victor sagged against the bar, all his careful composure finally completely gone, replaced by the hollow, defeated look of a man who understood at last that there was no scheme left clever enough to save him. The sheriff, who had watched the entire confrontation from the doorway with an expression of dawning uncomfortable realization, finally stepped forward, perhaps understanding that his own years of convenient blindness were about to be scrutinized right alongside Victor's crimes. "Victor Langford," he said, his voice unsteady but resolved. "You're under arrest, pending the circuit judge's review of these documents and testimonies." On whose authority? Victor spat some last vestige of arrogance flaring even in defeat. "Yours bought and paid for, the same as half this town." "On the authority of every name in that ledger," the sheriff said, and something in his own voice suggested a man beginning painfully to reckon with his own complicity. 14 dead men deserve at least that much from me, even 15 years late." As Hollis Beam helped restrain Victor for the sheriff, as the crowd's shocked murmur slowly gave way to something like collective disbelieving relief, Abigail found herself suddenly unsteady on her feet, the adrenaline that had carried her through weeks of danger finally draining away all at once. Nathan was there before she could fall, his arm steady around her, the same careful strength he'd offered the very first night in this same saloon. "You did it," he said quietly, just for her. "Abigail, you actually did it." "We did it," she corrected, leaning into him without hesitation. Now the weeks of careful distance between them finally fully closing. Every piece of this together. Curtis Yoder stood nearby. His family gathered close around him, tears streaming openly down his face, not from fear this time, but from the particular overwhelming relief of a man who had finally set down a burden he'd carried far too long. Elias Pruitt caught Abigail's eye across the room and gave her a small, respectful nod, the kind of acknowledgement that meant more from a man who'd spent 15 years too afraid to offer it. But even as the saloon buzzed with the shock of Victor's downfall, even as the sheriff led him out in restraints toward the town's small jail, Abigail understood that the fight wasn't fully finished yet. Victor Langford had money connections, a decade and a half of carefully cultivated influence beyond Red Creek's borders. A saloon full of witnesses and a stack of copied documents would need to survive contact with lawyers, with judges, with whatever resources a cornered man might still summon in his own defense. "This isn't over," she said quietly to Nathan, watching through the window as Victor was marched toward the jailhouse. "He'll fight this. Men like him always do." "Let him fight," Nathan said. 15 years he had this whole town too scared to even look at the truth straight on. Now he's got a town full of witnesses, a signed confession and evidence that ties every one of his schemes together in black and white. Whatever fight he's got left in him, it's a fight he's fighting alone now, Abigail. That's the difference. That's what today changed. Outside, word was already spreading beyond the saloon riders, heading out toward neighboring ranches. To spread news that would by nightfall reach every corner of the territory, Victor Langford had spent 15 years quietly terrorizing. Families who had lost land to his schemes, who had buried fathers and husbands under mysterious circumstances, and never dared question why, would soon learn that their silent grief had finally found a voice loud enough to be heard. And somewhere in that spreading truth, Abigail knew lay the beginning of something far larger than her own survival, far larger than Nathan's cleared name. The slow, painful unraveling of 15 years of buried injustice, finally brought into daylight by a widow who refused to stop asking questions, and an outlaw who refused to stop watching, both of them driven by grief, transformed at last into something that looked very much like justice. The circuit judge arrived 9 days later than anyone expected, having been sent for. The moment the sheriff finally found his courage, and Red Creek spent that time in a strange, uneasy limbo. Victor Langford locked in the small jailhouse, the town buzzing with a mixture of shame and disbelief that this had all been happening under their noses for 15 years. Abigail spent those 9 days building her case, the only way she knew how, methodically, patiently cross-referencing every filing they'd copied against the county records the sheriff had finally belatedly agreed to open for proper inspection. "You've barely slept," Nathan said. Finding her at the Brooks Ranch kitchen table, well past midnight, papers spread in careful stacks around a single guttering candle. "Can't afford to sleep," Abigail said, not looking up. "Victor's got money for lawyers, Nathan. Real lawyers, the kind who'll pick apart every gap in our evidence if I leave so much as one thread loose. I need this airtight before that judge sits down to hear it." Nathan pulled out the chair across from her and sat watching her work for a long moment before speaking again. "You know you don't have to carry all of this alone anymore." "I know," Abigail said, softer now, finally lifting her eyes to his. "Old habit, I suppose. Learned a long time ago that if I wanted something done right, I'd best do it myself. Nobody else was ever going to." "Well," Nathan said, "somebody's here now. Whatever you need copying, writing to fetch a witness, sitting up with you till dawn. So you're not doing this alone in an empty kitchen. You don't have to ask twice." Abigail felt something warm move through her chest, despite the exhaustion pulling at every part of her. "You've already given up 15 years chasing this, Nathan. I won't ask you to give up your sleep too." "Wasn't asking permission," Nathan said, a faint smile touching his tired face. "Just telling you how it's going to be." He stayed. Not just that night, but every night after, and somewhere in those long, candlelit hours of cross-referencing dates and signatures. Something settled between them that neither one needed to name out loud anymore, steady, certain, the particular closeness that grows between two people who have already proven under fire exactly who they are to each other. 2 days before the judge's arrival, word came that shattered the town's fragile calm all over again. Victor Langford had somehow gotten word out from his jail cell, a letter smuggled through a paid guard, addressed to a territorial lawyer in the capital, a man with connections deep enough to potentially quash the entire case before it ever reached formal court. "He's trying to buy his way out," the sheriff said, grimly showing Nathan and Abigail the intercepted letter. "This lawyer Whitmore, he's handled land disputes for half the cattle barons in the territory. If Victor's got the money to hire him, he could argue the whole case gets thrown to a territorial court, instead of staying local, tie it up in appeals for years." "Years," Abigail repeated, feeling the ground shift beneath her again. 14 families waiting years for justice they've already waited 15 too long for. "There's more," the sheriff said, hesitant now. "Word is Whitmore's already on his way. Might beat the circuit judge here by a full day depending on the roads." Nathan's jaw tightened. "Then we make sure whatever Whitmore tries to argue, it doesn't matter. We make the case so complete, so undeniable, that no lawyer in the territory can talk a judge out of what's sitting right in front of him." "How?" Abigail asked. "We stop relying just on paper," Nathan said. "Paper can be argued with twisted called forgery by a clever enough lawyer. We need living voices. Every family Victor's ever touched standing in that courtroom telling their own story in their own words. A lawyer can pick apart a ledger. He can't pick apart 14 grieving families looking a judge dead in the eye. It was Abigail understood immediately both the right answer and an enormous undertaking reaching families scattered across 3 counties in less than 2 days, convincing people who'd stayed silent for years to finally publicly speak. "I'll ride to the Coleman Ranch and the Fitzgeralds," Nathan said, already moving toward the door. "Elias knows the Prescott family personally. He can reach them faster than I could. You should stay here, keep organizing the documents." "No," Abigail said, standing so fast her chair nearly toppled. "I'm not staying behind while everyone else does the hard part, Nathan. I've spent 3 weeks proving I'm more than a woman who needs protecting from a distance." Nathan studied her for a moment, something like pride breaking through his worry. "Never said you needed protecting. Just worried about you riding these roads with Victor's money still buying loyalty in places we can't see." "Then I'll take the roads closest to town," Abigail said, already reaching for her coat. "The Hendersons and the Millers both lost land to Victor within the last 5 years. I know their stories better than anyone. I've read them a dozen times over in that ledger. Let me be the one to ask them." Nathan didn't argue further. He simply nodded, understanding, in the particular way he'd come to understand her these past weeks, that Abigail Carter had stopped being a woman anyone needed to shield from danger a long time ago. They rode out in different directions as dawn broke over Red Creek, and the next 2 days passed in a blur of hard-riding, difficult conversations and the slow, painful work of asking grieving families to relive their worst losses in service of a justice that had come far, far too late for the ones they'd already buried. Mrs. Henderson wept at her kitchen table when Abigail explained what had really happened to her husband 3 years before the sudden fall from a barn roof. Everyone had called an accident, the ranch that had transferred to Victor's hands within a week. "I always knew," Mrs. Henderson said, wiping her eyes with a trembling hand. "Deep down, I always knew something wasn't right. But what was a widow with 4 children supposed to do? Accuse the richest man in 3 counties of murder with nothing but a mother's instinct to back her up?" "You don't need instinct anymore," Abigail said gently. "You need to stand in that courtroom and tell the truth about what you saw, what you felt, what didn't add up. Let the evidence carry the rest." Mrs. Henderson agreed, tears turning slowly to something harder, more resolved, and Abigail rode away from that ranch with one more name added to the growing list of witnesses willing finally to speak. The Millers proved harder to convince, fear still thick in their voices even 3 years after losing their land. But by the second day, word had begun spreading faster than Abigail could ride. Families reaching out to other families, the collective courage of speaking together, proving stronger than the isolated fear each had carried alone. By the evening before the judge's expected arrival, 11 families had agreed to testify, their stories overlapping and corroborating in ways that painted a portrait of systematic murder and theft too vivid, too consistent for any lawyer to dismiss as coincidence or forgery. Nathan returned to the Brooks Ranch that same evening, exhausted but triumphant, having secured testimony from 3 more families, along with something else entirely. A stack of old newspaper clippings from a county archive 2 days' ride away, detailing accidental deaths going back further than even Nathan had realized. Patterns Victor Langford had been perfecting since long before Ezra Kane's death. "There's more than 14, Nathan said grimly, spreading the clippings across the kitchen table. "Least 18, maybe 20 going back better than 20 years. Victor didn't start this scheme 15 years ago. He started it as a young man and just got better at hiding it as he went." Abigail felt sick reading through the older clippings, the sheer scope of the devastation finally laid bare in black and white. 20 years, she whispered. 20 years of this, and nobody ever connected the pattern until now. "Nobody had a reason to look that hard," Nathan said. "Grief makes people want answers, not more grief piled on top. Took someone with your particular gift for numbers and someone with my particular grudge for patience to finally see the whole shape of it. They worked through the night, organizing everything into a single, comprehensive presentation. Testimonies, documents, newspaper clippings, Curtis Yoder's detailed confession, building a case so thorough that even a lawyer of Whitmore's reputed skill would struggle to find a single thread to unravel. Dawn found them both still at the table, exhausted, but nearly finished, and it was in that quiet gray morning light that Nathan finally reached across the scattered papers and took Abigail's hand. "Whatever happens today," he said, "win or lose in that courtroom, I need you to know something I should have said the night this all started." Abigail's breath caught exhaustion forgotten entirely. "I've spent 15 years running from what Victor took from me," Nathan continued. "Told myself I was chasing justice, and I was, but somewhere along the way, running became the only thing I knew how to do. Never let myself want anything past the next lead, the next piece of evidence, because wanting things felt like giving Victor one more way to hurt me." He tightened his grip on her hand. "Then you stepped off that stage into all this danger, and instead of running for the first time in 15 years, I found myself wanting to stay. Wanting a life past just chasing down the man who ruined the last one." "Nathan," Abigail whispered, tears rising unexpected and fast. "I love you, Abigail Carter," he said, plain and simple, the words carrying the particular weight of a man who didn't say such things lightly or often. "Whatever happens today, whether that judge clears my name or not, whether we win this fight, or Victor's money buys him one more escape, I love you, and I intend to spend whatever life is left to me proving it." Abigail crossed the small distance between them and kissed him, soft and certain, weeks of careful distance, finally fully dissolving into something neither of them needed to hide anymore. "I love you too," she said against his mouth. Somewhere between that saloon floor and this kitchen table, "Nathan Kane, you became the truest thing I've ever known." They had little time to savor the moment. Within the hour, word arrived that both the circuit judge and the lawyer Whitmore had arrived in Red Creek within an hour of each other. The courtroom, really just the largest room in the town hall, hastily arranged with borrowed chairs, filling fast with townspeople, eager to witness what promised to be the most consequential day in Red Creek's history. Judge Benjamin Holloway proved to be a stern-weathered man in his 60s, the kind of judge who had clearly seen every manner of territorial corruption in his years on the bench, and had grown tired, rather than cynical, of witnessing it. Lawyer Whitmore, by contrast, arrived polished and confident, precisely the kind of man Victor Langford's remaining money could still buy, sharp-suited, quick-tongued, already moving through the crowd with practiced charm, before the proceedings had even begun. "Your Honor," Whitmore began, once the room had settled and the judge called the proceedings to order, "before we waste this court's valuable time, I must object to the very nature of these accusations. My client, Mr. Langford, is a respected businessman, being persecuted by a coordinated conspiracy of debtors seeking to escape legitimate financial obligations." "A coordinated conspiracy," Judge Holloway repeated dryly, "involving 18 separate families across 3 counties spanning 20 years, all somehow organizing themselves against your client without ever once being caught in the act of collusion. Remarkable feat of coordination, counselor." A ripple of quiet laughter moved through the gathered crowd. Whitmore's confident expression flickered just barely. "Nonetheless, Your Honor, I'd ask the court to examine the evidence with appropriate skepticism, given the clearly personal and financial motivations of the accusers." "I intend to examine all evidence with appropriate skepticism," Judge Holloway said. "That includes your client's counselor. Now, if there's nothing further, I'd like to hear from the witnesses who've traveled considerable distance to be here today." What followed was, Abigail would later think, the longest and most important day of her life. Family after family stepping forward to tell their stories. Curtis Yoder's detailed confession, read into official record, the 20 years of newspaper clippings laid out chronologically to demonstrate a pattern too consistent, too deliberate to be dismissed as mere coincidence. Whitmore fought every step, objecting, cross-examining, attempting to poke holes in testimony and paperwork alike. But the sheer volume of corroborating evidence, family after family telling remarkably similar stories, despite having never met each other before that week, slowly, steadily overwhelmed even his considerable skill. The moment that truly broke the case wide open came when Nathan took the stand himself, recounting in plain, unflinching detail the death of his father 15 years before the wanted poster that had appeared 6 weeks after he'd dared confront Victor directly, the 15 years he'd spent as a hunted man simply for asking questions that deserved honest answers. "Mr. Kane," Whitmore said, attempting one last angle of attack, "you've admitted by your own testimony to breaking into the county land office, to various acts that could themselves be characterized as criminal. Why should this court trust the word of a man who has spent 15 years as a wanted outlaw?" Nathan met the lawyer's eyes steady and unflinching. "Because everything I did these past 15 years, I did chasing truth. A corrupt system refused to give me any honest way to find. You want to know why I broke into that land office? Because your client bought the sheriff, bought the notary, bought half this county's silence for 2 decades. A man forced outside the law to find justice ain't the same as a man who breaks the law to escape it. I think this court understands that difference better than you're pretending to." The room erupted in murmured agreement, and even Judge Holloway allowed himself a small approving nod before calling for order. By late afternoon, with the sun beginning its slow descent outside the crowded hall, Judge Holloway called for a brief recess before delivering his ruling, and Abigail found herself standing outside the town hall, with Nathan, both of them exhausted, hopeful and terrified in equal measure. "Whatever he decides," Nathan said, "we did everything we could. Every family got their chance to speak. Every truth finally got said out loud." "It has to be enough," Abigail said. "It has to be." When the court reconvened, Judge Holloway's expression had settled into something grave and final, and the room fell utterly silent as he began to speak. "In 23 years on this bench," he said, "I have rarely encountered evidence so thorough, so meticulously documented, and so thoroughly corroborated by independent witness testimony as what this court has heard today. The pattern of financial fraud, forged documentation, and suspicious deaths connected directly to Victor Langford spans 2 decades and no fewer than 18 separate ranching families." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle over the crowded room. "This court finds sufficient evidence to remand Victor Langford for full territorial trial on multiple counts of fraud forgery and pending further investigation by territorial authorities. Potential charges of murder in connection with the deaths of at least 14 ranch owners across this county." The room erupted a mixture of gasps and applause, and from several families in the crowd, open weeping, the particular grief of finally, after years of silent suspicion, having their worst fears officially confirmed and acknowledged. Furthermore, Judge Holloway continued, raising his voice slightly to be heard over the crowd's reaction. "Regarding the wanted status of Nathan Kane, this court finds substantial evidence that the original charges against Mr. Kane were fabricated at the direct instruction of Victor Langford, intended specifically to silence a man who had legitimate grounds to suspect Langford's involvement in his father's death. This court hereby orders the immediate dismissal of all charges against Nathan Kane, and formally clears his name across all 3 territories where the original warrant was issued." Nathan's hand found Abigail's gripping tight, and she felt him exhale a breath he'd been holding in some form or another for 15 long years. "It's over," he whispered, disbelief and relief warring plain across his face. "Abigail, it's actually over." But it wasn't, not quite, not yet. As the courtroom continued to buzz with the aftermath of the ruling, a commotion rose near the back of the hall. Hollis Beam, who had testified earlier that day against his former employer, pushing his way forward with obvious urgency. "Judge Holloway," Hollis called out, "there's something you need to know. Something Victor said to me back when he thought I'd still do whatever he asked." The room quieted again, attention shifting toward Hollis's clearly troubled expression. "He's got money hidden," Hollis said, "outside the territory in a bank up north under names that don't trace back to him. And he's got a man, a hired gun not local, brought in from outside 3 months back, kept on retainer in case things ever went bad enough that Victor needed to disappear quiet and permanent. If he's found guilty today, if he thinks there's no other way out, he'll run," Nathan finished grimly. "Or worse." Judge Holloway's expression darkened. "Sheriff, I want Victor Langford's cell checked immediately." The sheriff moved fast, several deputies following close behind, and the courtroom held its collective breath through the several agonizing minutes it took for word to return. When the sheriff burst back through the doors, his face pale and grim, Abigail felt her stomach drop before he'd even spoken a word. "He's gone," the sheriff said. Cells empty, guards unconscious but alive. Somebody helped him out, and given what Hollis just told us, I'd wager it was that hired gun he mentioned. The room dissolved into chaos, voices rising all at once, and Abigail felt Nathan's grip on her hand tighten to something almost painful. "He can't have gotten far," Nathan said, already moving toward the door, his 15 years of tracking instinct taking over instantly. "Not on foot, not without drawing attention. He'll need a horse supplies, and he'll want to move fast toward that territory line before word spreads." "Nathan," Abigail said, catching his arm, fear sharp and sudden in her voice. "This isn't your fight to finish alone anymore. Let the sheriff handle this. Let the law just spent 15 years failing to catch him," Nathan said, not unkindly but firm. "I'm not about to let him disappear now, not after everything it cost to get this far. Not after everything he still owes 14 dead families and everyone else he's hurt along the way." "Then I'm coming with you," Abigail said. "Abigail, don't," she said, echoing his own words back at him from days before. "I've earned the right to see this finished, same as you have. I'm not staying behind while you ride off into danger I helped create." Nathan looked at her for a long, searching moment, and whatever he saw in her expression, the same fierce, unbreakable resolve that had carried her through weeks of danger, already convinced him faster than any argument could have. "Fine," he said. "But you stay close, and you do exactly as I say the moment things turn dangerous. Understood?" "Understood." Abigail agreed, though both of them knew, given everything they'd already survived together, that promise carried more hope than certainty. They rode out within the hour, Elias Pruitt and 2 other ranchers joining, despite the sheriff's own posse forming separately, the whole town seeming to understand in that moment that this fight belonged to all of them now, not just the 2 people who had first dared to expose it. The trail led north toward the territory line Hollis had mentioned. Fresh horse tracks cutting clear through soft evening ground that told Nathan everything he needed to know about how recently Victor and his hired gun had passed. 20 minutes ahead of us," Nathan said, reading the tracks with the same careful precision Abigail brought to reading ledgers. "Maybe less. They're pushing their horses hard, which means they know we're coming." They rode through this gathering dusk with a shared wordless urgency, the same fear driving them both that after everything, after 15 years of patient waiting and weeks of dangerous investigation, Victor Langford might still slip through their fingers into whatever anonymous life his hidden money could buy him beyond the territory line. The trail finally converged near a narrow river crossing an hour before full dark, and Nathan raised a fist, signaling the small posse to slow and approach with caution. Through the fading light, they could see 2 figures at the water's edge. Victor disheveled and desperate, in a way that stripped away every last trace of his careful composure, and beside him, a lean, hard-eyed stranger Abigail recognized instantly as the hired gun Hollis had warned them about. "Victor Langford." Nathan called out, his voice carrying clear across the water. "This ends here, one way or another." Victor turned, and even from a distance, Abigail could see the wild, cornered look in his eyes. A man who had spent 20 years believing himself untouchable, finally completely undone. "You should have let this rest, Kane," Victor called back, though his voice cracked with something closer to fear than defiance now. "You and your widow both. I offered this territory prosperity, and all either of you did was destroy it out of spite." "You offered this territory murder dressed up as opportunity," Nathan said. 15 years, Victor. My father, her Samuel, 16 other families who lost everything to your greed. That's not prosperity. That's just theft with better handwriting." The hired gun's hand drifted toward his weapon, and Abigail felt her heart seize with fear, not for herself, but for Nathan, standing exposed at the edge of that riverbank, with everything they'd fought for hanging on the next few seconds. "Don't," Nathan warned his own hand steady near his belt. "Whatever Victor's paying you, it ain't worth dying for a man who's already lost everything. Judge already ruled. Territorial marshals will be combing this whole region within days. Best thing you can do for yourself right now is ride away clean before you're wanted for more than just being seen in bad company." The hired gun hesitated, weighing the truth of Nathan's words against whatever payment Victor had promised him. And in that hesitation, Abigail watched something shift. The particular calculation of a hired man realizing his employer's usefulness had finally completely run out. "He's right," the gunman said, finally stepping back from Victor's side. "Whatever you paid me, Langford, it wasn't enough to hang for murder on top of it. You're on your own now." He mounted his horse and rode off into the deepening dusk without another word, leaving Victor alone at the water's edge, finally completely stripped of every advantage he had ever possessed. Victor's shoulders sagged, the last of his fight visibly draining away, replaced by something hollow and defeated. 15 years, he said, almost to himself, staring at the dark water. 15 years of careful work, and it all comes apart because one widow couldn't leave well enough alone. It comes apart, Abigail said, urging her horse forward to stand beside Nathan. Because 14 families deserved the truth and you spent 15 years making sure they'd never get it. That's not my doing, Victor. That's simply justice finally catching up to what you always knew was coming. Victor looked at her for a long moment, something almost like grudging respect flickering behind his defeated eyes. "You truly are remarkable, Miss Carter. Under different circumstances, I might have admired you." "Under different circumstances," Abigail said, "you might have been a man worth admiring back. But you chose greed over every single life that stood in your way, and now you'll answer for every one of them." The sheriff's posse arrived minutes later, drawn by the same tracks Nathan had followed, and Victor Langford was placed under formal arrest for the second time that day. This time with no hidden money, no hired guns, and no remaining allies left to help him disappear. As they rode back toward Red Creek, under a sky finally clearing of storm clouds that had hung over the territory for days, Nathan reached across the space between their horses and took Abigail's hand. 15 years, he said quietly. 15 years I dreamed about this moment, and somehow the truth of it feels bigger than anything I ever imagined. Bigger how? Abigail asked. Never let myself imagine I'd have somebody beside me when it finally happened, Nathan said. Always figured I'd catch him alone, same as I'd spent every year since chasing him alone. Didn't expect this part. Didn't expect you. Abigail smiled, exhaustion and joy tangled together in equal measure. Well, Mr. Kane, I suppose the truth has a way of surprising even the most careful planners. They rode the rest of the way back to Red Creek in comfortable silence. The weight of 15 years finally truly lifted the town ahead of them, glowing warm with lantern light against the clearing night sky. The same town that had once stood silent while Abigail bled on a saloon floor, now waiting to welcome home. The two people who had finally taught it what courage looked like, spoken plain and unafraid after 15 long years of silence. Victor Langford's territorial trial took place 3 weeks later in the county seat, a proceeding far less dramatic than the confrontation at Red Creek's town hall, but no less decisive. Judge Holloway's findings, backed by the mountain of evidence Abigail and Nathan had assembled, left little room for any lawyer's cleverness to maneuver. Whitmore withdrew from the case entirely within the first week, unwilling to stake his reputation on a client whose guilt had already been laid bare before an entire county's worth of witnesses. Victor Langford was found guilty on all counts: fraud, forgery, and after territorial marshals completed their investigation into the deaths spanning 2 decades accessory to murder in the deaths of 11 ranch owners whose accidents could finally definitively be traced back to men Victor had hired and paid across the years. He was sentenced to life imprisonment in the Territorial Penitentiary, and Red Creek, for the first time in 15 years, breathed easy under a sky that finally belonged to itself again. Abigail stood outside the courthouse the day the sentence was read, Nathan's hand steady in hers, and felt something she hadn't expected to feel after everything. Not triumph exactly, but a quiet, settled peace, the particular relief of watching a long, terrible chapter finally close for good. "It's strange," she said as they walked together toward the horses. "I thought I'd feel more. Anger, maybe. Or something bigger than this." "Grief takes its time settling," Nathan said. 14 families lost people they can't get back no matter how long Victor rots in that cell. Justice don't undo loss, Abigail. It just makes sure loss doesn't keep happening unanswered. "Is that what 15 years taught you?" she asked. "Part of it," Nathan admitted. "Rest of it, I learned these past 2 months, watching you turn grief into something that actually changed this whole territory for the better." He glanced at her, something warm and certain in his tired eyes. "Never thought I'd say this, but I'm almost grateful for every hard thing that happened if it led me to you." They rode back to Red Creek together that afternoon, and the town that greeted them felt different somehow. Lighter, freer, the particular weight of 15 years of silence finally lifted from every street corner and storefront. Children played openly in front of the mercantile, where fearful whispers had once passed between wary adults. Elias Pruitt sat on his porch as they passed, raising a hand in easy greeting, rather than the cautious nod he'd once reserved even for friendly faces. "Something's changed here," Abigail said, watching the town move around them with new eyes. "It's not just that Victor's gone. It's like the whole place finally remembered how to breathe." "Fear's a heavy thing to carry," Nathan said. 15 years this whole town carried it together without ever saying so out loud. Now that it's gone, I reckon everybody's just now noticing how much lighter they feel." The Brooks Ranch waited for them at the end of the road, and Abigail felt her heart settle at the sight of it in a way she hadn't quite expected when she'd first arrived grieving and lost all those weeks before. What had begun as a stranger's inheritance, tied to a man she'd never truly known, had slowly, steadily become something else entirely. A home built not on the promise of a marriage that never happened, but on truths uncovered and fought for with her own two hands. "What will you do now?" Nathan asked that evening, as they sat together on the porch, watching the sun sink low and gold over the western ridge. "Ranch is yours, free and clear. Samuel's debts are cleared, his name restored alongside mine. You could build whatever life you want here now." Abigail considered the question seriously, watching the light change over land that had already witnessed so much grief, and more recently, so much hard-won justice. "I keep thinking about Mrs. Henderson," she said finally, "and the Millers, and every other family who lost everything to Victor, and never had anybody with a head for numbers to help them understand what had really happened, or fight for what was rightfully theirs." She turned to look at Nathan directly. "I don't think I'm meant to just quietly farm this land and forget everything these past months taught me. I think I'm meant to use it." "Use it how?" "There's no proper land office clerk anymore, not one Victor didn't corrupt." Abigail said, the idea forming clearer as she spoke it aloud. "What if we built something here, an office open to any family in this territory who needs help understanding a contract, tracing a deed, making sure nobody ever gets swindled the way Samuel was, the way your father was, the way 14 other families were before anybody dared to stop it?" Nathan's expression shifted slowly from surprise into something like wonder. "You want to turn grief into an institution." "I want to turn grief into protection," Abigail corrected gently. "So the next Victor Langford who thinks he can hide behind confusing paperwork and frightened silence finds this territory a lot less welcoming to that kind of scheme." "I like that," Nathan said, and the smile that spread across his face then was unguarded in a way Abigail had rarely seen from him. 15 years of careful watchfulness finally softening into something closer to genuine hope. "I like that a whole lot, Abigail Carter." They began building the office within the month, converting a small structure near the ranch's entrance that had once served as Samuel Brooks's tool shed into something new entirely, a modest room with a sturdy desk, careful filing cabinets, and a hand-painted sign above the door that simply read, "Brooks and Kane, Land Records and Assistance." Word spread quickly through the surrounding counties. Families who had quietly suffered under confusing debts and suspicious transfers, some connected to Victor's old schemes, and others, simply the product of ordinary predatory lending, began arriving at the small office, seeking help untangling contracts they'd never fully understood. Abigail found in that work a purpose that felt larger than anything she'd imagined for herself back when she'd stepped off that stage from Missouri, with nothing but a dead man's letter and $11 to her name. Every family she helped, every fraudulent contract she uncovered, before it could claim another home, felt like a small, steady repayment against everything Victor Langford had stolen from this territory over 20 long years. Nathan, for his part, found his own place in the work as well, his years of tracking and investigation proving invaluable when families suspected fraud but lacked proof, his patient, careful presence a steady counterweight to Abigail's sharp, analytical mind. "Never thought 15 years chasing one man would end with me running an office," he told her one evening several months into their new venture, only half joking. "Figured I'd either catch Victor or die trying. Never pictured this." "Disappointed?" Abigail asked, though she already knew his answer. "Not for one single day," Nathan said, and meant it completely. Their work together deepened something that had already been growing steadily since that first terrible night in the saloon. Not the desperate adrenaline-fueled closeness of shared danger, but something quieter and more lasting, built through long days of careful work and longer evenings of easy conversation. Two people who had proven to each other under the worst possible circumstances exactly who they truly were. It was on a crisp autumn evening, almost exactly 1 year after Abigail had first stepped off that stage into a life she never could have anticipated, that Nathan finally asked the question that had been building quietly between them since that rain-soaked night outside the Mercantile. They stood together near the fence line where they'd first truly spoken as allies rather than strangers. The same spot where Nathan had first shared the truth about his father, where Abigail had first shown him the copied ledger pages that would eventually bring down 15 years of buried injustice. "I've been thinking," Nathan said, uncharacteristically nervous, in a way that immediately caught Abigail's full attention, "about how a year ago I was a wanted man with nothing but grief and grudges to call my own, and how somehow in the space of one impossible year I ended up with a cleared name, a purpose worth waking up for, and the finest woman I've ever known standing beside me through all of it." "Nathan," Abigail said softly, already sensing where this was heading, her heart climbing into her throat. He reached into his coat and withdrew a small simple ring, clearly handmade, clearly crafted with more care than money. "I know this ain't fancy," he said. "Made it myself, actually, out of a piece of silver I've been carrying since before I even knew your name, saved from selling off the last thing that belonged to my father's ranch before Victor took it all. Figured it deserved to become something worth keeping, instead of just something I carried out of grief." Abigail's eyes filled with tears, watching him kneel there in the autumn evening light. The same steady, careful strength he'd shown her from the very first night finally laid bare and vulnerable in front of her. "Abigail Carter," Nathan said, "I've spent this whole year learning that courage ain't just about facing down danger. It's about being willing to want something, to hope for something, even after everything life's already taken from you. You taught me that. Every single day since that saloon, you've taught me that. So I'm asking you plain, no more careful distance between us. Will you marry me?" "Yes," Abigail said before he'd even fully finished the question, laughing and crying all at once as she pulled him up from his knee into an embrace that carried the whole weight of everything they'd survived together. "Yes, Nathan Kane, 1,000 times yes." They married 3 weeks later in a ceremony that drew nearly the entire town of Red Creek, held right there on the Brooks Ranch, under a sky so clear and blue, it seemed Abigail thought, like the whole territory itself, was finally allowed to celebrate something good after 15 long years of buried fear. Elias Pruitt gave a short, gruff toast that had half the gathered crowd wiping away tears, speaking plainly about courage and the particular debt this whole territory owed to a widow and an outlaw who'd refused to let fear win. Curtis Yoder stood near the front with his family, finally free of the guilt that had haunted him for years, his own small role in exposing Victor's crimes, never forgotten by the community he'd once helped, however unwillingly, to harm. Mrs. Henderson attended too, along with several other families whose lives Victor Langford had shattered and who had, in the months since his conviction, slowly begun rebuilding on land legally restored to their names through the careful work of the Brooks and Kane Land Office. "Never thought I'd see a day this joyful again," Mrs. Henderson told Abigail during the celebration, embracing her warmly. "You gave this whole territory something we'd forgotten we were even allowed to hope for. We gave it to each other," Abigail said, glancing across the gathered crowd to where Nathan stood, laughing with Elias, looking for the first time since she'd known him entirely at peace. "I couldn't have done any of it alone." As the seasons turned, and the Brooks and Kane Land Office grew from a small converted shed into a respected institution serving families across 3 counties, Red Creek itself transformed alongside it. The particular fear that had gripped the town for 15 years under Victor Langford's careful cruelty gave way slowly but steadily to something the town hadn't experienced in generations. Genuine trust between neighbors, a willingness to speak plainly rather than swallow suspicion out of fear. Hollis Beam, who had turned against Victor at the critical moment in that crowded saloon, found his own path toward redemption in the years that followed, working alongside Nathan on several occasions to track down other fraudulent schemes that had sprung up in neighboring territories, men who'd learned from Victor's methods and hoped to repeat them elsewhere before Abigail and Nathan's growing reputation made such schemes considerably harder to hide. "Strange thing, redemption," Hollis said to Nathan once, several years into their unlikely partnership. "Never thought I'd end up working alongside the man I once helped Victor hunt. But I suppose people can change given the right reason." "Everybody deserves the chance to prove which kind of man they really are," Nathan said, once the fear that was controlling them finally lets go. 2 years after their wedding, Abigail gave birth to a daughter, and they named her Grace, a name Abigail had chosen deliberately, thinking of every family who had finally found some measure of grace after years of buried injustice, thinking too of Samuel Brooks, whose quiet courage in gathering evidence against Victor, even at the cost of his own life, had set everything that followed into motion. Nathan held his daughter for the first time with the particular careful wonder of a man who had spent 15 years believing himself too hardened, too consumed by grief and grudge, to ever build something so entirely gentle and new. "Never thought I'd get this," he said quietly to Abigail, watching tiny fingers curl around his own weathered hand. 15 years I told myself justice was the only thing worth living for. Turns out justice was just the road that led me here to something even better than I ever let myself imagine." "You earned every bit of it," Abigail said, exhausted and radiant in equal measure. 15 years of patient courage, Nathan. Nobody deserves this kind of peace more than you do. The Brooks and Kane Land Office continued its work for decades after that first difficult year, becoming something of a territorial institution, training a new generation of careful record keepers who understood, as Abigail had learned through painful necessity, that protecting a family's home required exactly the kind of patient, meticulous attention that fear and complacency too easily allowed to slip away. Red Creek itself grew and changed over the following years, new families arriving drawn by the town's hard-won reputation for fairness and transparency, a place where the particular corruption that had once ruled unchecked for 15 years had been replaced by something the town's residents now guarded fiercely. The understanding that silence, however comfortable, always came at a terrible cost, and that courage, however frightening, was the only true protection any community truly possessed. Grace grew up hearing the story of her parents' courage told and retold at town gatherings, at church socials, at the particular kind of storytelling evenings small frontier towns favored when the work of the day was finally done and neighbors gathered to remember together the history that had shaped them. She grew up understanding in a way few children her age ever had cause to learn so directly, that her mother had once knelt bleeding on a saloon floor and found even in that darkest moment the courage to ask for help rather than accept silent defeat. She grew up knowing that her father had spent 15 years as a hunted man rather than abandon the truth he knew in his heart, and that his patience, however costly, had ultimately proven stronger than the fear that had once ruled an entire territory. On the 10th anniversary of Victor Langford's conviction, the town of Red Creek gathered once more at the very same saloon where everything had first begun, though the building itself had changed considerably in the intervening years. Brighter now, more open, serving as much as a community gathering place as a drinking establishment. The particular darkness that had once haunted its walls, slowly replaced by 10 years of better memories, layered carefully overtop the worst one. Abigail stood near the same spot where she'd once collapsed, bleeding and desperate, and felt the strange, powerful weight of having transformed that memory into something entirely different through a decade of steady, patient work. "Strange, isn't it?" she said to Nathan now, silver beginning to touch his temples, still every bit the steady, careful man she'd fallen in love with a decade before. "Standing here again after everything. Strange," Nathan agreed. "But good strange? This town remembers what happened here, Abigail. Not just the violence, but everything that came after it too. That matters. That's how you make sure the lesson actually holds." As if summoned by his words, a commotion arose near the saloon's entrance. A young woman, clearly a recent arrival to the territory, stumbling through the doors, with obvious distress, fleeing from a man following close behind her, his intentions written plain and threatening across his face. For one terrible suspended moment, the whole saloon seemed to freeze, the same particular silence Abigail remembered from 10 years before, beginning to settle over the room. But this time, something different happened. Before the silence could fully take hold, before fear could once again claim an entire room of witnesses, 3 separate ranchers rose from their chairs at once, moving to place themselves protectively around the frightened young woman. "That's enough," one of them said firmly to the pursuing man. "Whatever business you think you've got with this young lady, you'll state it plain in front of witnesses, or you'll turn around and leave her be." Elias Pruitt's grandson, now grown into a steady young rancher himself, stepped forward as well, his voice carrying the particular confidence of someone raised on stories of courage rather than stories of fear. "We don't do things quiet in this town anymore," he said. "Not since folks learned what quiet costs." The pursuing man, faced with unified resistance, rather than the silent complicity he'd clearly expected, backed away and left without further incident. And the young woman, shaking but safe, was gently guided to a seat and offered water and comfort by several of the very same townspeople who a decade before might have stood silent and watched a similar scene unfold without lifting a single hand to help. Abigail felt tears rise, unexpected and warm, as she watched the scene play out, Nathan's hand finding hers without either of them needing to speak. "She proved it," Nathan said softly, watching the young woman finally begin to relax under the town's protective care. 10 years ago, right here, right on this spot, she proved that one voice, one act of courage really can change an entire town. "We proved it together," Abigail corrected gently, echoing words she'd spoken to him once before, in the earliest, most dangerous days of their fight against Victor Langford. Every family who finally spoke up, every witness who finally found their courage, every single person who decided silence wasn't acceptable anymore. They stayed at the saloon well into the evening, watching Red Creek's newest generation carry forward a lesson that had cost this territory dearly to learn. And Abigail found herself thinking, as the celebration continued warm and easy around them, about everything that single terrible night 10 years before had ultimately set into motion. A widow arriving grief-stricken and alone had found in herself a courage she'd never known she possessed. An outlaw hardened by 15 years of solitary grief had found in himself a willingness to finally stop running and start fighting for something worth building, rather than simply something worth avenging. A town that had learned painfully and slowly that silence in the face of injustice always eventually cost more than the courage required to speak. Victor Langford remained in the territorial penitentiary, his once formidable influence reduced now to nothing more than a cautionary tale told to warn new generations about the particular danger of unchecked power, operating unseen behind a mask of respectability. He would die there years later, largely forgotten by a territory that had long since moved past the fear he'd once wielded so effectively. His name remembered chiefly as a reminder of exactly what silence allowed to flourish unchecked: Abigail Carter. Kane, meanwhile, continued her work at the land office well into her later years, training her own daughter, and eventually her grandchildren, in the careful, patient work of protecting families from exactly the kind of corruption that had once nearly destroyed her own life before it had properly begun. Nathan Kane, his name fully cleared, and his reputation transformed from feared outlaw to respected pillar of the community he had once been forced to haunt from its shadows, spent the remainder of his days exactly where he'd told Abigail on that very first dangerous night he intended to remain, protecting something finally worth protecting. Their story became, over the decades that followed, something Red Creek told its children not merely as history, but as instruction proof that even in the darkest moment, even surrounded by 50 silent witnesses, too afraid to help, courage remained possible. Proof that even a man broken by 15 years of grief and injustice could rebuild himself into something worth becoming. Proof above everything else that evil thrives precisely in the silence. Good people allow it, and that justice, however delayed, however difficult, remains always within reach of anyone brave enough to finally truly speak the truth aloud. The final word on Abigail and Nathan Kane's remarkable story, carved eventually into a simple stone marker outside the Brooks and Kane land office that continued serving Red Creek's families for generations after their passing, captured everything their extraordinary year together had ultimately proven true. A truth as solid and unshakable as the ground beneath that hard-won frontier town itself. Silence protects no one but the guilty. Courage, however small it begins, is the only thing that has ever truly changed the world.